All right, so this is my last wrap up for the semester. To be honest with you, I got in my head a little bit about this, right? Because you guys asked so many questions that were so good throughout the semester, and I thought it's my duty to find answers to all of them. So I spent kind of a long time trying to find, what the evidence is showing. And basically, we're at this weird point in the research where we're just not getting clear answers, which I'm going to talk about. But I'm starting to get end of the semester wrap up questions coming in, and I thought I better record this now. So we made it through. If you're watching this, you made it through. A few notes. Number one, I taught this class because I thought it would be fun and important. So when I teach an application-based class, it's a special kind of class. So race and gender is one that I teach. I'm actually teaching economics and art in the fall. I teach the economics of developing nations, the economics of COVID. These are like special classes where you can practice stuff, right? So it's like we look at a topic and we practice all our economics tools. So I think there's some benefits that come from this that I want to point out. And I saw them happening with you guys. Number one, I think applying economics helps solidify our understanding of the basics. So we learned about sticky wages, right? But now you're saying, oh yeah, that's right, sticky wages is happening, right? We're starting to see people get raises and maybe short run aggregate supply shifting to the left. One of you guys mentioned that you didn't know the difference between a recession and a recessionary gap. There we go, we're cleaning it up, right? So it's like an opportunity to really like fill in some loose ends in our knowledge, which I think is really helpful. We're exposed to viewpoints different than our own. Of course, that's something that's more likely to come up in an application-based class. It happened the last time I taught the economics of COVID. It happens in developing nations. I mean, it always happens. But I think it's important to note that I think all were intelligent, useful, and well argued, which I really appreciated. It's good to feel humble. I think that happened in this class, especially with the monetary policy class. I hope I made you feel a little better about that by acknowledging how little I truly know, right? But it's just helpful, right? We're learning this thing that's just really far beyond our reach, and that's how our students feel all the time. So I just think it's a helpful thing to recognize. The other thing is we're getting stuff that we can use in our classrooms. And this happens to me the more I teach these applied classes. I learn a little tidbit that I can use somewhere else, right? So for example, you might talk about, I don't know, we're talking about like restaurants and how restaurants really suffered. When we teach about monopolistic competition now, we've got a really helpful example. So I have this little sentence here: applied classes seep into our brains. They really do. Sometimes I'll be, someone will ask a question, I'll say, well, actually, it's similar to, the cellular thing. And I didn't even know it was in my brain, right? So the more we're exposed to economics in different ways, the smarter I think we are. So it was really fun to be able to teach this class with you guys. And man, you guys are fun to teach too. I told you, I would say to my husband, man, these teachers are good. They're so motivated. They're so smart. It was just a real pleasure. So we're just coming off the race and gender long run changes week. And I have to be honest with you guys. I thought the race stuff was going to be controversial. And some of you guys told me, you're not supposed to teach race stuff in your class and all this stuff. I just assumed it would be controversial. The pay gap was controversial. So I just want to say a few notes about this. So, and it's kind of a risk teaching you, because to really cover the pay gap, you have to spend more time than we did. But the pay gap is one of my favorite things to teach because it's a lesson in econometrics, right? So we can look at the statistics. Women make 84 cents for every dollar a man makes. And then of course we all say, why? Is it discrimination? Does this prove discrimination? Is it because of choices women are making? And it really is, it's one of my favorite things to teach because it's not an either or, it's a both and. It's everything. So when I say it's a lesson in econometrics, I mean, this shows what econometrics can do. So we know women make 84 cents for every dollar a man makes. How much of it is due to education? How much of it is due to major, industry, hours worked? And then like a good question you might be asking Is this just based on full-time work or is it part-time? Because that might be explaining it. It actually is only full-time workers, and usually we control for hours worked. But basically what happens is we use econometrics, we use regression analysis, which is something that you guys really aren't learning, but it is an important part of economics. I'll talk about what it means later. But we use our statistical tools to get some answers, right? And those answers get us to the number 92. So once we control for all that stuff, for all of the industries and really the choices women are making, things I call supply side factors, the wage gap is about 8%, right? So women make 92 cents for every dollar. So then, of course, one of the things we learn about in statistics is that correlation doesn't equal causation. I don't know if it's the exact use of it here, but basically the question is, can we prove this is discrimination, right? First of all, if you're looking at 84 cents to the dollar, that does not prove discrimination, and I can show you all sorts of evidence that says it's due to women's choices. When you look at the 92%, after controlling for everything, does this prove there's discrimination? The answer is no, right? So just because women make less money does not prove there's discrimination. It fits with a story of discrimination, but it doesn't prove it. And so then it becomes helpful because it says, well, with regressions, can we ever prove causation? And the answer is no. The only way we can prove causation is with something called an instrumental variable. And if you're interested in it, I'm happy to talk to you about it. It's a statistical technique, or you run an experiment. And so one thing that we see in the gender stuff is people do run experiments. So for example, there's an experiment where people sent resumes to restaurants in Philadelphia. And one had a woman's name and one had a man's name, and they were identical resumes. And they showed that women were less likely to get interviews and less likely to get, they'd say, how much would you pay this person? And they had a lower offer. That proves discrimination, okay? But the problem with experiments is that it's something called external validity. It proves discrimination in restaurants in Philadelphia. It doesn't prove it everywhere else, okay? So it's just a really interesting statistical question. But again, it's not either or, it's both and. And I think one of the reasons this was so, it like touched on some nerves for you guys is because I think like half the class just assumed, everyone who talks about the wage gap is claiming discrimination. And I think the other half of the class is like, the wage gap shows discrimination. And of course, it's more complicated than that. So I just wanted to show you my midterm for race and gender. I thought you might be interested in it. 30-point question. How large is the gender pay gap? How large is the unexplained gender pay gap? List two things that might be causing the unexplained gender pay gap. Is there evidence for any of these? These might be, some people did talk about discrimination, and there is evidence for it. Some people talked about like the presence of young children, whatever. Look at D and E. Suppose someone says the reason women get paid less than men is because of their choices. Describe why that person is correct. E. Describe why that person is incorrect. So of course, they're correct and they're incorrect. Why are women paid less? Because of their choices. Yes. Is it just because of their choices? No. So I just thought that was an interesting week, and I think you guys handled it well. This has never been controversial. I teach the pay gap plenty of times, and students are always like interested to learn more. They just never thought much about it. But you guys are adults and working adults, and so it was interesting to see you had brought like different viewpoints in. So hopefully that was a helpful thing. I really like to teach it. It's a lesson in complexity. It's a lesson in statistics, whatever. All right. So another question that some of you guys were posing in the article about learning outcomes is, okay, we keep hearing about this, right? It's super sad. We've got this different, this gap in income, like high income versus low income students, black versus white. Someone mentioned, was it Amanda, that I think it was like, why are we talking about Latino students? And I just want to mention this, how I would view it as an economist. So if someone asked me, what is the solution? What I would talk about first is incentives. So a lot of you guys said, my hands were tied because I couldn't fail anyone. So what was the student's incentive to do well? it's an incentive issue, right? So we need to fix the incentives, have some incentives for doing well, incentives for catching up, whatever. The other thing is that, all these school districts are trying stuff. You're talking about, oh, mine tried a summer school thing, mine tried whatever, an extra long like homeroom, some of you said. And the way an economist would look at this is not, is this good or bad? It's let's get the data, right? So just because something makes sense does not mean that it will work. And I'm a development economist, so I'm very familiar with being disappointed with things that we think are going to work, right? Like we think universal primary education that was the solution. I can give you all sorts of evidence that didn't work. One of my papers talks about how 70% of students are beaten by teachers, for example. So one of the things that I would say as an economist is, okay, let's think about incentives and then let's get data and let's see if it works. And then the other thing I was going to mention, and this was something that popped in my head as I was reading your comments. So as a development economist, one of the questions we talk about is, why do kids not go to school? Like, it used to be a primary school. Now kids are going to primary school. Why do kids not go to secondary school in developing countries? One of my favorite concepts is by this man named Lant Pritchett. And he says, well, we need to diagnose it. Is it a demand side issue or a supply side issue? So is the issue that there's not enough supply of schools, or is the issue there's not enough demand for schools? And if you get that wrong, you're not going to fix it. So for example, if the issue is that kids aren't going to school in India because you don't learn, the teacher doesn't show up, kids aren't learning to read, that's a demand side issue. If you get a supply side policy, which is let's build more schools, you're just going to make it worse. You're going to have more schools that kids don't go to. If you've got an overcrowded school, then clearly the demand is there, and so you need more supply. It's a supply side constraint. So if we think about like some of the stuff that we might propose, like maybe after school programs, maybe that's a solution that might help. It might help low income parents. They won't have to pay for after school care. They can work more. The kids get mentoring, whatever. The question would be, is there demand for it? Is there supply of it? So I don't know if any of this makes sense, but it's kind of like when we're looking at a problem, I feel like as humans, we tend to think, well, more education is intuitive, or more mentorship, that's intuitive. But we can get a little bit more nuanced with our solutions. Okay, so basically what I'm saying is it's complicated, as everything in economics is. I don't think there is a clear solution, but economics can kind of teach us tools to evaluate the solutions, which is something that I think is helpful. All right, so a note about theory versus empirics. So if you've taken Econ 501 with me or 502 with Professor Devaraj, those were largely theoretical classes. Professor Devaraj is a data person. She probably did look at data, but like a lot of what you learned is theory. And so I just want to mention, there are theoretical economists and there are empirical economists. Maybe it's like 3 empirical to 1 theory these days. I'm an empirical economist. I love statistics. I think statistics is maybe even more helpful than theory in some cases. But so we like learn this theory. Like, for example, when the economy is failing, what the government needs to do is increase aggregate demand. Government spending has the highest multiplier. That's what the theory says. But what I'm telling you is that's half the story. What we also need is we need the empirics. We need to look at the data. And that's actually not something that you guys are going to be learning in your dual credit program, which I think is fine because you're not teaching it, right? But there's this whole thing over there. So I want to talk a little bit about the empirics. So published research is subject to peer review, the peer review process, meaning when I write a paper, it's sent off to some reviewer who reads it and says, is it good or bad? Is it legit? Should I change anything? And I'm a reviewer too. I just review the paper. And it's very, very stringent, and it takes a really long time. So one of my papers I started in 2007, got published in 2016. Like, it takes a long time. So we don't have the peer-reviewed papers for COVID. They're just starting to come out. So what we have is something different. I'm going to stop here and record a new video and pick up right here.